How did a simple shepherd become the greatest king in Israel's history? Stay until the end and discover how David defeated a giant, faced relentless persecution, and revealed secrets that can transform your life even today. In a lush field among the hills of Bethlehem, a young shepherd walked among the sheep, watching them closely. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky with golden and orange hues. This was David's world, simple and peaceful, yet full of challenges. He was the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons, the son nobody paid much attention to. His older brothers were away, fighting battles or being prepared for important roles, while David stayed with the sheep, far from the honors and attention. However, David did not mind this. He was alone, but he felt God's presence in a unique way. In the fields, far from the distractions of the city, David found his refuge in God. The young shepherd, with his pure and humble heart, spent hours playing his flute and composing songs for the Lord, learning each day to trust God completely. Little did he know he was being shaped for something extraordinary. It was then that God, in his wisdom, sent the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem. The Lord had a mission for Samuel, to anoint the next king of Israel. Saul, the current king, had disobeyed God, and his rejection was imminent. When Samuel arrived at Jesse's house, he was immediately introduced to the older sons, who were impressive, tall, and seemed like the perfect choice for a king. However, God said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. With this, Samuel observed each of Jesse's sons one by one, but God chose none of them. It was as though something was missing. Confused, Samuel asked, "Do you have any other sons?" Jesse, surprised, replied, "I still have the youngest, David, but he's in the field taking care of the sheep." Then Samuel said, "Bring him here. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives." When David entered the room, the Spirit of God moved upon Samuel, and God said, "This is the chosen one." In the presence of his brothers, who were also there, Samuel anointed David with oil, and at that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Although David was still very young, that simple act marked the beginning of a journey that would change Israel's history. He was chosen, not for his strength, but for his heart, his faithfulness, and humility before God. The first secret of David is that God looks at the heart. He does not choose those who are outwardly impressive, but those who possess humility and faithfulness in their hearts. David was neither the strongest nor the most handsome, but he was chosen by God for his willingness to serve him, regardless of appearances. This teaches us that, unlike what the world values, God honors those who are faithful and humble before him, even in the simplest tasks of life. Sometimes we seek recognition in the wrong places, but God is waiting for a pure heart ready to obey. David did not know what the future held for him, but from that moment on, he was being prepared for something great. While Jesse's other sons went about their lives, David continued tending the sheep, unaware that God was training him in the field for a reign that would come later. Shortly after David was anointed by Samuel, the Philistines gathered in Soko to wage war against Israel. The Israelite army was lined up in battle formation, but instead of marching to fight, they were frozen by the immense threat standing before them. This battlefield was unlike any other. The giant Goliath had been challenging Israel for 40 consecutive days. Every morning, he would emerge from his tent, towering and imposing, clad in his gleaming armor with a disdainful look. He mocked the army of God, taunting their courage, saying, "Choose a man to fight me. If he defeats me, we will surrender. But if I win, the entire army of Israel will become our slaves." The Israelite army, faced with his physical strength and towering stature, felt small and powerless. No soldier dared to face the giant, not even King Saul, who, being a tall man with battle experience, should have been the first to accept the challenge. Fear was evident on everyone's faces. They saw Goliath as an unbeatable threat, and the battle seemed lost before it even began. Meanwhile, in Bethlehem, at his father's house, David, a simple shepherd, continued with his daily routine. He was unaware of the events unfolding at the military camp, but his father, Jesse, called him and asked him to take food to his brothers who were on the battlefield. David, always obedient and faithful, eagerly accepted the task, unaware that this simple act would lead him to a meeting with his destiny. Upon arriving at the camp, David immediately saw the Israelite army in panic. His brothers were among the soldiers, and that was when he first heard Goliath's challenge. The giant mocked Israel, and the terrified soldiers retreated. What struck David the most was everyone's lack of action. He looked at the men and asked, "Why are you all so afraid? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he dares to challenge the armies of the living God?" His brothers scolded him, telling him to stay out of the situation. They saw him merely as a boy who didn't understand the seriousness of war. But David was undeterred. He didn't focus on the size of the giant but on the lack of faith among those around him. Word of David quickly reached King Saul, who summoned him. When David entered Saul's presence, the king looked at him and said, "You cannot fight this Philistine. You're just a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth." David, however, was not shaken. He knew the battle was not his but God's. With confidence, he replied to the king, "When I was tending my father's sheep, a lion and a bear came and took a sheep. I chased them and struck them down, and God delivered me from their claws. This Philistine will be no different. The Lord will deliver me from him too." Impressed by David's faith, Saul tried to convince him to wear his armor and weapons, but David, unaccustomed to the heavy equipment, refused. Instead, he took his sling, a simple shepherd's tool, and selected 5 smooth stones from the stream. David knew that what he needed was not a sword or shield but faith in God. The second secret of David is that no matter the size of the giant, what matters is the faith you have in God. David was not intimidated by Goliath's stature because he knew that God was with him. The Israelite soldiers saw only a giant of flesh and blood, but David saw a spiritual challenge. He understood that victory did not rely on weapons or physical strength, but on faith in God, who could defeat any enemy. How often do we look at our problems and feel small and powerless? Like David, we must remember that our strength does not come from ourselves but from God. When we place our trust in Him, no giant is too big for divine intervention. But the battle was about to begin, and what would happen next? No one could have predicted. David was ready to face the impossible, but how far would his faith and courage take him? The tension was palpable, and the outcome remained a mystery. What David did not know was that the victory he sought would bring consequences far greater than he could have ever imagined, and could change Israel's history forever. When David stepped onto the battlefield, the scene was desperate. The Israelite army, filled with fear, seemed to have already lost before the fight even began. The giant Goliath, over 9 feet tall, with his gleaming armor and sharp spear, once again challenged the soldiers of Israel. His thunderous voice echoed through the camp, mocking, taunting, and attempting to crush the courage of God's people. "Choose a man. If he defeats me, we will surrender. But if I defeat him, the entire Israelite army will become my slaves." David, with his eyes fixed on the giant, was not shaken. What he saw was not an unbeatable warrior, but an opportunity for God's glory. The faith in his heart burned brighter than any fear surrounding him. He had been chosen by God for a far greater purpose, and nothing, not even a giant, could prevent what was about to unfold. The Israelite army watched as David approached Goliath. The giant, with a look of disdain, gazed at the young man and laughed. He mocked David's appearance, scorning the simple figure of a shepherd against his own immense strength. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks and stones?" Goliath said, full of rage. David, however, did not waver. He raised his sling and, in one swift motion, placed a stone in it. His eyes were fixed on Goliath, but his heart was even more fixed on God. He knew this battle was not his but God's, and that God would never let a challenger to the armies of the Lord prevail. David launched the stone with precision, and in a miraculous moment, the stone struck Goliath's forehead with such force that the giant fell to his knees, as if pulled by an invisible power. The sound of the impact was like thunder, and the Israelite army, which had been silent and fearful, erupted in a shout of victory. The battle, which had seemed lost before it began, was already won. But the victory was not due to David's skill with the sling but because God was with him. The third secret of David is that true strength comes from trust in God, not in circumstances or the weapons we possess. Goliath was physically immense, but David knew that with God by his side, even the greatest giant would be reduced to nothing. He teaches us that, no matter how insurmountable the problems in our lives may seem, when we place our trust in God, the impossible becomes possible. Sometimes, God's answers don't come in the form of human strength, but in simple trust that He will guide us, no matter how great the obstacle. David didn't defeat Goliath by his strength, but through his faith. But David's victory over Goliath was only the beginning. What he did not yet know was that by defeating the giant, he had ushered in a new era for Israel, but he had also attracted new enemies. David's fame spread quickly, and now he would become more than just a simple shepherd. He would be Israel's hero. But the attention he received would not always be positive. King Saul would no longer see David as an ally but as a threat. David did not know that while he prepared to receive the honors of victory, his greatest challenge was still ahead. A challenge that would test his loyalty, his faith, and his patience in ways he could never have imagined. After David's victory over Goliath, the Israelite army was jubilant. The Philistine giant had fallen, and the people of Israel finally began to see a promising future, with the young shepherd as their hero. David became a popular figure, revered by all. His courage and faith had made him a symbol of hope for a nation living under the constant threat of the Philistines. David's fame spread quickly, and he soon became a constant presence in King Saul's court. Initially grateful for David's victory, the king invited him to serve in his palace. But what seemed like a great friendship soon turned into a deep rivalry. When the Israelite army returned from a victorious campaign, the women of the city came out to celebrate. They sang and danced, praising the heroes of the day. But amidst the songs, something unexpected happened. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. These words, which at first seemed like mere praise for David's bravery, struck Saul's heart like a sharp blade. The king, who had once welcomed David as an ally, now saw him as a threat. Envy and jealousy began to consume Saul's soul, and he could no longer hide his resentment toward the young man. Saul's anger grew so intense that, in a moment of desperation, he began to see David with different eyes. No longer did he view him as a national hero, but as someone challenging his throne. The king feared that David would become more powerful than him, and this fear took root in his heart. Blinded by envy, Saul tried to kill David several times. On one such occasion, while David was playing the harp to calm Saul's troubled spirit, the king grabbed a spear and hurled it at the young man. David narrowly escaped, finding refuge in different places and living as a fugitive. The friendship between them, which had once seemed so promising, turned into persecution and distrust. David, a young man chosen by God to be king, was now being hunted by the very king of Israel. Saul, consumed by insecurity and jealousy, could no longer see God's hand upon David, and the trust that once existed between them was replaced by relentless pursuit. Meanwhile, David did not retaliate. He knew that the Lord was in control of all things. Even in the face of constant danger, he remained faithful to God and respected King Saul's authority. David had no desire to take Saul's throne by force but patiently waited for God's timing. The fourth secret of David is that he knew how to wait for God's timing, even when surrounded by envy and persecution. Instead of retaliating and seeking revenge against Saul, David trusted that God would protect him and that, at the right time, he would take the place that had been promised to him. At times, when we face injustices or persecution, the temptation to retaliate or act in anger can be overwhelming. But David teaches us to wait on God. He understood that God would bring justice in due time. No matter how others may mistreat us or try to bring us down, trusting in God and being patient will always prevail. Sometimes, God uses difficulties to prepare us for something greater, and Saul's persecution became a training ground where David learned to rely on God more than on his own strength. As David fled from Saul's pursuit, he did not know that the greatest test of his faith was still ahead. The king continued to hunt him, but there was something within David that compelled him not to give up. He understood that if he was being pursued, it was because God still had a great plan for him. Yet the ultimate test of his patience and faithfulness would come in an encounter that would change everything. Saul's pursuit of David intensified each day. The king of Israel, consumed by envy and fear, was willing to do anything to destroy the young man he saw as a threat. David, on the other hand, continued to flee, but instead of growing angry at Saul, he remained trusting in God and waiting for the right moment. It was during one of these moments, while David was hiding in the caves of En-Gedi, that God gave him a unique opportunity to test the character he was shaping in David. Saul, upon learning where David was, decided to personally enter the cave to kill the young man. With an army of soldiers at his side, Saul went after David. But something unexpected happened. Saul entered the very cave where David and his men were hiding, unaware of their presence. It was a golden opportunity, one of those moments where many would think, now is the time for David to act. Now he can finally take revenge. David's men, seeing the opportunity, said to him, "This is the day the Lord spoke of. I will deliver your enemy into your hands. Do with him as you wish." David's men expected him to seize the opportunity and kill Saul, who was completely defenseless. But David, filled with wisdom and reverence for God, did not act impulsively. He only cut off a piece of Saul's robe without the king noticing. After doing so, David felt remorse even for having touched the king's robe and said to his men, "May the Lord forbid that I do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the one chosen by the Lord." David, with a pure heart and unwavering faith, did not raise his hand against Saul, even though he had every reason to do so. He understood that despite Saul being an unjust and cruel king, it was God who had placed him there, and only God had the authority to remove him. After Saul left the cave, David followed him and, from a distance, called out to the king, "My lord the king, why do you listen to men who say, 'David wants to harm you'? Look, here is the piece of your robe. I could have killed you, but I didn't. And now, knowing this, I have no other desire but to ask you to repent of your pursuit of me." Saul's response was remarkable. He, moved by David's action, recognized that the young man was more righteous than he. Saul became deeply remorseful and said to David, "You are more righteous than I am because you have rewarded me with good, and I have rewarded you with evil." This act by David was not just a demonstration of physical courage, but, most importantly, a testament to the purity of his heart. He understood that forgiveness did not come from an emotional impulse but from trust in God and his justice. Despite all the difficulties he faced, David did not seek revenge but surrendered everything into God's hands, trusting that he would resolve the situation justly. The fifth secret of David is that true forgiveness comes from a heart that trusts in God. When David refused to kill Saul, he was not simply being kind. He was demonstrating complete trust in God's justice. He understood that, even though he was being unjustly persecuted, God had a perfect plan for his life and that revenge was not his role. At times, it's difficult to forgive those who hurt us. Our natural tendency is to want to repay evil with evil, but David's story teaches us that true forgiveness comes when we trust that God has control over all things. Forgiveness is not about the other person but about ourselves, allowing God to be the judge and, by forgiving, letting go of our need to control the situation. David did not deny the pain or injustice he suffered, but instead of seeking revenge, he sought God, and God honored him for it. True forgiveness is liberating, and David knew that by releasing Saul, he also freed himself from the pain of persecution and hatred. However, even after this act of forgiveness, David's story was not over. Saul may have repented in that moment, but his doubt and jealousy were still present. David's journey was far from finished, and greater challenges lay ahead. David understood that God was shaping him for something greater, but he would still have to face many internal and external conflicts while waiting for God's perfect timing to take the throne. David's story was far from a tale of glory but rather a process of formation and faith. After the moment of reconciliation where David forgave Saul, many believed that the king's pursuit had finally ended. However, Saul's change of heart was only superficial. His anger and fear that David would take his throne were stronger than ever. Even after admitting his fault, Saul could not change his stance toward David, and the tension between them grew once more. David's life became increasingly difficult, and he was forced to live as a fugitive, constantly moving to escape Saul's grasp. David did not want war, yet Saul's relentless pursuit drove him to a situation where there was no turning back. The king was determined to eliminate David at all costs. Now a refugee, David began seeking shelter outside Israel, fleeing to foreign lands. He went to Achish, king of Gath, a Philistine city, hoping to find protection. Upon arriving in Gath, he was recognized by the locals as the same David who had killed Goliath. Fear gripped David's heart, as he was afraid that the Philistine king, Achish, would hand him over to Saul. In this moment of great pressure, David had to rely on his cunning. To avoid capture, David pretended to be insane in front of Achish, letting saliva run down his beard and acting completely irrationally. The strategy worked, and Achish, confused and worried that David might be mentally unstable, decided not to pursue him further. Thus, David managed to escape to the cave of Adullam, where many distressed and desperate men like him began to gather around him, forming a small army of outcasts. Even with his army growing, David knew he could not live in exile forever. The loneliness and constant persecution had brought him to a breaking point of despair. But it was there, in the cave, that David experienced God's real presence in a profound way. He sang psalms, prayed, and sought strength in God, knowing that his hope lay not in weapons or his own strength, but in divine providence. The Lord did not leave him alone. During this difficult period, David was strengthened and began to understand that his journey of suffering was shaping him into a stronger leader, one more dependent on God. But David's story would not only be marked by victories, but also by moments of brokenness and deep reflection. The sixth secret of David is that God uses moments of greatest weakness and despair to strengthen us. David's flight to the cave of Adullam symbolizes how, in our moments of loneliness and despair, God can find us and strengthen us spiritually. When we are at our lowest, God is at work in us, shaping us for something greater. David did not lose his faith, even when it seemed that every door was closed. He trusted that, even in exile, God had a purpose. What seemed like the end of everything was actually an opportunity for David to deepen his relationship with God and prepare for the kingship that was yet to come. How often in our lives do we feel alone, pursued, or hopeless? David teaches us that in these moments, faith must be our sustenance. Trust in God should never be replaced by external circumstances, because God is faithful to fulfill his promises, even when everything seems lost. But David's journey was far from over. While he was being strengthened in the cave, God was preparing something much greater for him. Revenge against Saul could have been an immediate impulse for David, but God was working to ensure that he would be recognized as the legitimate king, not by the power of his sword, but by the strength of his faith. After everything that had happened, David knew his journey was still incomplete. He had spent many years fleeing, facing challenges, forgiving, and enduring trials that had matured him. He was no longer the young shepherd who played the harp in the mountains. David had become a man shaped by pain but with unshakable faith. The story of David and Saul seemed to be finally reaching a critical point. Saul, desperate to eliminate the threat he saw in David, continued to pursue him. Yet the truth was that the king himself was beginning to realize that his days in power were numbered. Doubt and insecurity corrupted him, and he was starting to lose control of the kingdom. David, for his part, was still being pursued but also knew that the opportunity for revenge was within his reach. One night, while being chased, David and his nephew Abishai managed to approach Saul's camp while the king slept, surrounded by his soldiers. The temptation was great. David had the perfect opportunity to end his enemy once and for all, the man who had relentlessly hunted him. Abishai, in his eagerness, suggested that David kill Saul while he slept, saying, "God has delivered your enemy into your hands today. Let me kill him once and for all, and there will be no more persecution." But David, with a heart full of wisdom, replied, "Do not kill him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and remain guiltless?" David knew it was not his responsibility to destroy Saul. He trusted that if it was God's will, the Lord would bring justice in his time. So, instead of killing Saul, David took the king's spear and water jug that were by his side without being noticed and walked away. When morning came, David called out to King Saul and his soldiers from a distance, challenging them with the water jug and spear he had taken. He said to Saul, "Why do you pursue me, my lord? Look here, your spear and your jug. I could have killed you, but instead, I bring these as a sign that my intention was never to harm you." Once again, Saul was moved by David's actions and recognized that David was right. Deeply remorseful, with tears in his eyes, Saul asked for forgiveness. "You are more righteous than I. I have pursued you without cause, and you have shown me kindness. May the Lord bless you and make you king over Israel." The relationship between the two, though marked by many highs and lows, now seemed to be nearing its end. David knew that moment was closer than ever. The seventh secret of David is that even when we have the opportunity to administer justice ourselves, God calls us to trust in his divine justice. David had several chances to kill Saul and end his pain and persecution, but he chose to trust that if it was God's will, Saul would fall on his own. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. Many times we are tempted to take control of situations and seek revenge when we are wronged. But David's story teaches us that true strength lies in trusting that God has control over everything, and that our obedience to him is more important than satisfying our own desires for justice. David did not seek revenge. He trusted that God would resolve the situation in his perfect time. And by doing so, God honored his faith and prepared him to ascend to the throne of Israel. But David's story was not yet over. Though King Saul had repented for a moment, he could not change his unstable nature, and before his death, he would face one final battle. David's journey was about to take a significant step forward, and his ultimate destiny was still being prepared by God. After years of fleeing, persecution, and challenges, the moment had finally arrived. David had not only survived but had been forged in the fire of his trials. He had learned God's secrets, strengthened his faith, and was now ready to assume leadership over Israel. With Saul's death, the kingdom of Israel was in ruins, but God's plan for David was about to be fulfilled. The people knew that the promise made to David would be kept, but the transition to his reign would not be simple. Although David was God's chosen one, there was resistance. Saul's son, Ishbosheth, was proclaimed king by a group of loyal followers, and the kingdom was divided. David had to contend with internal divisions and, once again, place his trust in God to be the judge and guide on his journey. However, God's hand was upon David, and after a series of battles and alliances, the people of Israel finally recognized David as the legitimate king. He was not just a military leader, but someone who won the hearts of the people. He ruled with wisdom, and his reign began to bring peace and prosperity to a nation that had previously lived in constant conflict. When David was finally crowned in Hebron, he made a historic step. It was not pride or arrogance that overtook him, but a profound sense of gratitude and humility. He knew that none of it would have been possible without God's guidance and help throughout his journey. And so David, the shepherd boy who rose against the giant Goliath, who endured Saul's persecution, and who learned to wait for God's timing, finally took his place as king of Israel. He had not achieved the throne through military strength, but through his faithfulness and trust in God's sovereign plan. David's reign brought prosperity, but it also taught that true leadership comes from a humble heart obedient to God. He was anointed not because he was perfect, but because he was a man after God's own heart. His story is a testament to how God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things, transforming weaknesses into strengths and making the impossible possible. When David reflected on his life, he understood that true victory was not in the battles he had won, but in the relationship with God he had cultivated throughout his journey. God chose him not for his physical appearance or his warrior skills, but for his heart. David's true secret was his dependence on God in every moment, whether in the cave of Adullam or before Goliath. David became the greatest king of Israel, but Jesus would later come as a descendant of David, and through his lineage, he would bring salvation to the entire world. The final secret of David is that God honors those with a pure and obedient heart. David's journey, with all its difficulties and challenges, teaches us that true greatness comes from our total dependence on God, not from our abilities, wealth, or external achievements. David was great because his faith never wavered, even in the darkest hours of his life. When we put God first, he leads us to achieve the impossible, just as he did with David. What can we learn from David's story? That even in the most difficult moments, God is preparing us for something greater. He strengthens us, teaches us, and guides us. No matter how many giants we face, God has a purpose for us, and nothing is impossible for him. And so, David's journey shows us that with God, we can even conquer the impossible. Now, it's up to us to put David's secret into practice, to trust completely in God and move forward with courage, because if he has chosen us, nothing can stop us. Did you enjoy David's epic journey? Now it's time for you to reflect on what you've learned from David's story and how this faith can be applied to your life. Leave a like if you believe that God can help you achieve the impossible. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any incredible stories of overcoming, faith, and victories based on the Bible. And if you know someone who needs to hear about David's strength and trust in God, share this video with your friends and family. Comment below. What was David's greatest secret for you? How can you apply the secret in your own life? May you all stay with God and with the wisdom of the Word.